I found out my wife was sleeping with 3 different men because one of their wives called my office before she confronted her own husband. By then, I already knew enough to feel sick, but that phone call was the moment the whole thing stopped looking like a messy affair and started looking like a system. My wife hadn't just cheated on me, she had built an entire second life and disguised it as a successful business. When Elise first told me she wanted to expand her interior design work into premium weekend consultations, I bought it completely. It sounded smart, it sounded ambitious. She had spent years building a respectable client base, and for the first time it felt like her business could push us past comfortable and into real financial breathing room. I worked as a financial advisor in a smaller market, and while my income was steady, it was never going to explode. Elise's new idea felt like our shot. She stood in our kitchen one Saturday morning, coffee in one hand, leather portfolio on the counter, explaining how wealthy clients with impossible schedules needed private weekend access. They would pay more for discretion, more for flexibility, and a lot more for her full attention. I remember feeling proud of her. I remember thinking she was finally getting the level of clients she deserved. She gave me 3 examples right away, and looking back, that should have mattered more than it did. The first was a recently divorced real estate developer with a lakefront house that needed a total redesign after what she described as a brutal split. The second was a contractor overseeing a Victorian renovation that needed weekend coordination because all the specialty tradesmen were booked during the week. The third was a restaurant executive opening new office space and insisting on being personally involved in every decision because of how much money he was putting into the project. At the time, all 3 stories sounded believable. In fact, they sounded exactly like the kind of clients a growing designer would brag about. Elise talked about custom finishes, tight deadlines, high expectations, and big budgets. I nodded along and started doing math in my head about what that kind of income could do for us. For a while, everything reinforced the lie. Elise left early on weekends dressed better than she ever dressed for ordinary client meetings. She came home tired, animated, and full of stories about indecisive men, expensive materials, and demanding schedules. She showed me selective photos of rooms in progress, close-up shots of stone samples, lighting options, and fabric swatches spread across wide tables. She started talking about premium suppliers and private referrals, and the money coming in looked real enough to keep me quiet. Debts got paid down. We started talking again about finally renovating our own bathroom. She said some of the clients preferred cash for speed and privacy, which sounded odd, but not odd enough for me to push back when the results were sitting right there in our accounts. Then the pattern started changing our actual life, and I still explained it away. Elise's phone never left her side anymore. She stepped out during dinner to take calls. She walked into the garage or onto the back patio and came back saying a client had a last-minute question about delivery schedules or tile selections. She started dressing like every appointment was a high-end social event instead of a design consult. More fitted dresses, better heels, more perfume, better makeup. If I asked about it, she gave me the same answer every time. Image matters with wealthy clients. And because that sentence made sense on paper, I let it cover a lot of things that should have bothered me more than they did. The first real crack came when I was looking for a tire pressure gauge in her trunk and found a shopping bag shoved behind the spare. Inside were expensive silk lingerie sets, all brand new, all clearly her size. When I asked her about it, she didn't even hesitate. She said one of her clients had given them to her as a thank you gift, and then she rolled her eyes like I was being naive about how rich people behaved. I wanted to believe her, so I did. But that answer stayed with me, and it sat there in the back of my mind getting heavier every time she rushed to answer a late-night call. A few days later, her phone rang during dinner, and she got up so fast she nearly knocked over her water glass. She took the call in the garage, and through the wall, I heard something that had no business being in a professional conversation. Not words, tone, soft laughter, intimate laughter. The kind of voice you use when you already belong to the person on the other end. She came back inside glowing, sat down across from me, and told me it was about marble samples. I looked at her, nodded once, and for the first time since all of this started, I didn't believe a word she said. After that dinner call, I stopped reacting like a husband and started paying attention like a man who knew he was being managed. I didn't accuse her. I didn't pick a fight. I just watched. And once I started watching, the whole thing looked different. Elise wasn't just busy, she was rehearsed. Every answer came too quickly. Every explanation was polished before I even asked the question. If I mentioned a late return, she had a client story ready. If I asked why she needed an overnight bag for a weekend consultation, she said the lake house was too far for safe driving before sunrise. If I looked at her clothes a little too long, she reminded me that wealthy people judged everything, including appearance. She had a reason for everything, and the scary part was how normal it all sounded if you only heard each excuse by itself. What broke that illusion was seeing the small details pile up where she didn't think I was looking. Her filing system used to be almost obsessive. Receipts, invoices, project notes, supplier lists, all of it used to be sorted and easy to track. Then certain pieces started disappearing. Cash withdrawals showed up in odd amounts. Her client names shifted slightly depending on when she told the story. One night, she said she was meeting with Victor about flooring samples. 2 days later, the same story became a discussion with the contractor about trim work. Then she corrected herself and acted annoyed that I was trying to keep up with her schedule like I was some kind of auditor. I backed off in the moment, but mentally, I stopped taking anything she said at face value. The moment that really shoved me forward happened in a grocery store checkout line. 2 women in front of me were talking, not quietly, about a married interior designer who was making a fool out of her husband while openly flirting with men on job sites. One of them mentioned expensive dresses, a lake house, and how embarrassing it was to watch this woman throw herself at contractors like no one would notice. I remember standing there with a basket in my hand, hearing a description of my wife from complete strangers, and feeling like the floor dropped half an inch under me. They didn't know I was behind them. They didn't know who I was, and that made it hit harder because there was no performance in it. It was gossip, the kind people only repeat when they think something is obvious to everyone except the spouse. That night, I watched Elise pack for another so-called weekend consultation, and everything about it felt dirty. She folded silk sleepwear into the bag like she was preparing for romance, not work. She packed expensive toiletries, jewelry, and a perfume she never wore around the house. I asked where she was staying, and she gave me that same calm answer about early scheduling at the lake property. I asked why she needed half her bathroom shelf for a work trip, and she smiled like I was being cute. Because unlike you, she said, I have to look presentable in front of clients with standards. That line stayed with me long after she left. It wasn't just dismissive, it was contempt. And once contempt shows up in a marriage, the rest usually isn't far behind. The next morning, I pulled the phone records. We were on the same account, and I had never bothered looking because I had never had a reason to. What I found took me from suspicion to structure. There were hundreds of calls and texts to 3 specific numbers, and they weren't happening in some clean little block during business hours. They were happening late at night, early in the morning, during weekdays when she was supposedly running errands, and on weekends while she was supposedly working through design meetings. Some of the calls lasted 40 minutes, some ran over an hour. I traced the numbers one by one. The first belonged to a real estate developer. The second was tied to a construction company owner. The third was linked to a restaurant corporation. Those weren't random men. Those were her 3 clients. I remember sitting at my desk staring at those records and feeling something cold settle into place. Up to that point, there was still a part of me trying to rescue the story. Maybe one of them was inappropriate. Maybe she blurred lines. Maybe she liked attention and let things get messy. But the phone logs killed all of that. This wasn't one lapse. It wasn't bad judgment. It was a routine. 3 men, all mapped neatly onto the exact story she had fed me from the beginning. And the more I looked, the more obvious it became that she hadn't created those fake business explanations after the fact. She had built them in advance so every suspicious thing would already come with a clean, professional cover. I barely slept that night. Elise came home late, tossed her keys on the counter, and launched straight into a story about lighting revisions and a delayed stone shipment. I stood there listening to her talk with the same voice she'd probably used on all three of them, smooth and easy and completely confident. And I realized I was done trying to catch her with questions. She was better at lying than I was at hoping. So the next morning, before she even left the house, I called a private investigator and hired him on the spot. By noon that same day, the investigator had already confirmed more than I was ready to hear. His name was Calvin Rhodes, and he had the kind of voice that made bad news sound even worse because he never dressed it up. No sympathy in the tone, no dramatic pauses, just facts. He called me 3 hours after Elise left for what she had described that morning as a full-day consultation at the lakefront property. Calvin said her car was there, but not parked in the open drive. It was tucked inside the garage, out of view from the street. Then he told me Victor Hale, the recently divorced real estate developer, was also on site, and based on what he'd seen so far, they were not discussing furniture placement. He sent me the first photo a few minutes later. I stared at my phone in my office and felt my chest go hollow. Elise was standing on the dock with Victor, both of them close enough that there was no room left for excuses. The next image was worse. They were kissing like people who had done that 100 times before. Not awkwardly, not impulsively, not like two people crossing a line for the first time. They looked comfortable, familiar, like they had a routine. Calvin later told me they had spent close to 2 hours inside the house before coming outside, and by the way they moved around each other, there was no question about what that time had been used for. I remember putting my phone face down on the desk and just staring at the wood grain for a full minute because my brain needed time to catch up to what my eyes had already accepted. Any last bit of denial I had died when Calvin found the second man the same day. After Elise left the lake property, she drove straight across town to Darren Pike's workshop. Darren was the construction company owner tied to the Victorian renovation story she'd been feeding me for months. Calvin caught her arriving before he did, then pulled footage from a neighboring business camera to lock in the timeline. She had gone directly from one man to the other. Not on different weekends, not on separate occasions, in one morning. When she finally came out of the workshop, her hair was a mess, her blouse wasn't sitting right, and Darren walked her to the car like he had every right to touch her. Calvin got that too, him leaning into the driver's window, him kissing her before she pulled away. I had hired the man less than a day earlier, and already the whole marriage was rotting out in broad daylight. What made it worse was how normal Elise sounded that evening. She came home smiling, kicked off her heels near the door, and started telling me about marble options and labor schedules while she poured herself a glass of wine. I stood there in our kitchen looking at a woman who had just slept with one man, gone straight to another, and then walked through the front door acting mildly tired from a demanding workday. There are moments when anger feels hot, but this wasn't one of them. It was colder than that, colder and heavier. I realized I was living with someone who could look me directly in the face and lie without even a flicker of strain. That did something to me. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was disgust. Calvin kept following her for the next 2 weeks, and the pattern got even uglier because of how organized it was. Elise wasn't scrambling. She wasn't hiding one reckless affair. She was operating on a schedule. Victor for luxury and privacy at the lake house. Darren for daytime meetups tied neatly to renovation talk. And then Leon Voss, the restaurant executive, who was harder to pin down because his office was inside a secured corporate building. Calvin could document her going in and out, could log the dates and durations, but he couldn't get eyes on what happened inside without blowing surveillance. Even so, by that point, I didn't need much imagination. I had already seen enough to understand the shape of the truth. 3 men, rotating access, business as camouflage. What I still didn't know was whether the men understood the arrangement or thought they were each getting some exclusive version of her. Calvin had his own opinion. He told me people running multiple affairs this cleanly usually have one of 2 systems. Either the partners are being lied to separately, or everybody knows just enough to stop asking questions as long as they keep getting what they want. I remember that line because it stayed with me. It made the whole thing feel even more degrading. I wasn't just the husband being cheated on. I was the only person in the room who hadn't been given the script. Then Nadia Voss called my office. She asked for me by name, and from the first 10 seconds of that conversation, I knew exactly why she was calling. She had found hotel receipts, texts, and enough suspicious movement in her husband's schedule to hire her own investigator. Her voice was controlled, but barely. She told me she had photos of Leon with Elise at restaurants, in hotel lobbies, in parking lots, and leaving private entrances together. She said she was calling me before she confronted her husband, because if our positions were reversed, she would want to know first. That was the moment the last piece locked into place. Not suspicion, not probability, certainty. My wife hadn't slipped. She had built a system, and for months she had trusted that I would stay exactly where she wanted me, grateful, busy, and blind. After Nadia's call, I stopped thinking in terms of pain and started thinking in terms of sequence. I had enough evidence to blow the whole thing up that same day, but I didn't want a shouting match in my kitchen followed by another round of lies. I wanted leverage. I wanted the next move to be clean, documented, and impossible for Elise to twist into some story where I was paranoid, controlling, or cruel. So I took Calvin's full report, made a copy of everything, and sat down with a divorce attorney that afternoon. His name was Martin Kessler, and he only needed about 10 minutes with the file before he looked up at me and said, "You do not confront this kind of person before the paperwork is ready." That was the first sentence anyone had said to me that felt solid. Martin went through the evidence the way a surgeon studies scans. Dates, timestamps, locations, patterns, financial overlap, phone records, surveillance photos, all of it. He said the strength of the case wasn't just that Elise had been cheating, it was that she had created a false business structure around the affairs and used marital time, marital trust, and shared finances to support it. That mattered. It showed planning. It showed deception with repetition. It showed that this wasn't one emotional lapse she could cry her way around in court. It was conduct. Deliberate, repeated, organized conduct. By the end of that meeting, I had signed the paperwork to begin the divorce, approved the filing strategy, and agreed to let Martin move fast before Elise had any idea the ground under her was gone. The next morning, she left the house in another fitted dress with her leather portfolio tucked under her arm, kissed me on the cheek, and told me she had a long consultation at the lake house. I remember standing in the doorway, watching her walk to the car, and realizing how many mornings had looked exactly like that. Same smile, same confident stride, same fake little apology about being home late. This time, instead of going to work and spending the day sick to my stomach, I went straight to Martin's office and signed the final set of filing documents. He had arranged for Elise to be served at the lakefront property. Not at home, not privately. Right there, in the place she had used as one of her stages. She called me about 30 minutes later, and she was already screaming before I said a word. Not crying, not confused, furious. Her first sentence wasn't, "What is this?" or "Can we talk?" It was, "How could you do this to me in front of a client?" I still think about that because it told me everything. Even cornered, even exposed, her first instinct was image. Not marriage, not truth, not remorse, reputation. I let her burn through about 10 seconds of anger, then I hung up. She called back 3 more times. I didn't answer any of them. By then, I was already in the process of leaving the life she thought she still controlled. While she was racing home, I was packing what I needed. Clothes, work materials, personal documents, medication, a few things from my office, and the box where I kept the most important financial records. Martin had already warned me not to turn the house into a battlefield, so I didn't touch anything that would create unnecessary drama. I left the furniture, I left the dishes, I left the marriage photos on the wall because I didn't care enough to take them down. Then I drove to a furnished apartment across town that I had leased that afternoon through a short-term arrangement Martin's office recommended for clients in messy domestic situations. I checked in, dropped my bags near the bed, and sat on the edge of the mattress in complete silence. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, there was no performance happening around me. That same evening, I made one more decision. I mailed copies of the evidence involving Darren and Leon to their wives. Nadia already had her own proof, but I sent mine anyway so nobody could claim confusion later. Darren's wife deserved to know what kind of man she was married to, and Leon's wife deserved every piece of documentation I had. Victor was divorced, so there was no spouse to notify, but I dealt with him myself. I met him in person the next day with a slim folder of printed photos. He looked shocked for about half a second before shifting into damage control, saying Elise had told him she was already divorced and trying to rebuild her life. I told him I didn't care what story she sold him. I only cared that he never contacted her again. For once, being the calmest man in the conversation felt like power. By the end of that week, the first cracks in Elise's perfect arrangement were already turning into collapse. The men she had rotated so confidently through our marriage were all being forced to look at what she really was, and none of them were rushing in to save her. That was when I knew this was no longer about proving the betrayal. It was about watching the structure she built with lies start to fall under its own weight. The collapse happened faster than I expected, and what shocked me most was how little loyalty there was once the truth became expensive. For months, Elise had managed 3 separate men, 3 separate lies, and one fake business model that made her look successful, while I stood there funding the stable side of her life. The second those lies became legal risk, public embarrassment, and financial fallout, every one of those men started backing away. That told me more about the entire setup than any photo ever could. Whatever she had with them, it wasn't love, and it definitely wasn't worth the damage once the bill came due. Victor Hale was the first to disappear. After I confronted him with the printed evidence, he shifted from smooth and confident to defensive almost immediately. He kept repeating that Elise had told him she was recently divorced, that she had painted herself as a woman rebuilding after a failed marriage, and that he thought he was helping her get back on her feet. I didn't believe half of that, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that by the end of the conversation, he was done. The lake house stopped being a consultation site overnight. Darren Pike went the other direction. He got angry. Not at me, really, but at the situation. According to him, Elise had told him we were separated and just dragging out the paperwork because of shared finances. He called her a liar, said he wanted nothing more to do with her, and threatened to involve his own lawyer if she kept contacting him. Leon never called me directly, but Nadia did. She thanked me for sending the additional evidence, and her tone had changed. She was still hurt, but now she sounded focused. Their marriage was over, and from what she told me, Leon's life was about to get very expensive. Elise, meanwhile, went from rage to panic in less than a week. At first, she tried the usual tricks. She left voicemails calling me cold, cruel, and dramatic. Then she switched to claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that I had misread professional relationships and embarrassed her in front of important clients. That story didn't last long because my attorney had already made it clear what we had. So then came the next version. She said the marriage had been emotionally dead for a long time, that she had felt abandoned, that she had made mistakes because she was lonely and overwhelmed. I listened to one voicemail where she tried to cry through an apology without ever saying the words 3 men or months of lying. That was the pattern with her. Every message was designed to move the spotlight off what she had actually done and back onto how she felt now that consequences had arrived. The legal side moved quickly because there just wasn't much room for ambiguity. Martin filed for temporary orders, and the court granted me exclusive use of the house while the divorce moved forward. Elise had to find somewhere else to stay, which became its own humiliation because her premium weekend income wasn't real in the way she had implied. A lot of the cash flow she built her image around had come from the men themselves, directly or indirectly. Gifts, trips, meals, hotel rooms, personal expenses disguised as business costs. Once those men pulled away, the lifestyle collapsed almost immediately. She couldn't keep up with the clothes, the appearance, the false image of a designer on the rise. Even worse for her, she had to go to family for help, and that meant telling some version of the truth. However she framed it, the bottom line was the same. She needed money because the marriage was ending, and the business she had bragged about was built on deception. Then the professional damage started. We lived in a small enough business community that reputations moved faster than facts. But in this case, the facts were bad enough on their own. Clients talk. Contractors talk. Spouses definitely talk. Once the story got out that Elise had been using her interior design work as cover for affairs, people stopped seeing her as ambitious and started seeing her as reckless. Projects dried up. Referrals stopped. People who might have looked the other way a personal mess got uncomfortable when they realized the personal mess had been woven into the business itself. Martin also found enough irregularity in the way she handled certain transactions and represented parts of her portfolio that it triggered a review of her professional conduct. I'm not pretending every bad rumor was deserved, but the core damage was. Trust was her business, and she had burned it down herself. By the time we were a few months into proceedings, I could see something I hadn't been able to see while we were still living under the same roof. Elise had never just been cheating. She had been running a system built on contempt. Contempt for me, because she assumed I'd stay grateful and quiet. Contempt for the men, because she lied to each of them in whatever way made access easier. Contempt for the wives, because their marriages were just collateral damage. And contempt for the business itself, because she wrapped everything in the language of professionalism so nobody would question her. Once I saw it that clearly, the hurt didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became easier to let go of the version of her I had been trying to save in my head. The divorce was finalized in just under 6 months, and by that point, there wasn't much left for Elise to argue. The evidence was too clean, the timeline was too consistent, and the financial records told the same story the surveillance did. I kept the house, my retirement accounts, and most of the savings because the court had no trouble seeing who had been stabilizing the real household and who had been using that stability to finance deception. Elise got limited support for a short period, barely enough to get through the transition, and even that felt more generous than the truth deserved. I didn't walk out of it feeling victorious. I walked out of it feeling finished. There's a difference. Victory sounds exciting. This felt like clearing wreckage. I heard pieces of what happened after through mutual contacts, and none of it surprised me. Leon's divorce cost him heavily. Darren's marriage collapsed when the full picture came out. Victor's name got attached to exactly the kind of story men like him hate having follow them around. And in a town where image matters, that kind of stain sticks. As for Elise, the high-end version of herself she had been performing disappeared almost overnight. The expensive clothes stopped. The luxury weekends stopped. The illusion of this rising designer with elite clients dried up because people finally understood what those client relationships had really been. Last I heard, she was working sales at a furniture store, which honestly felt like the most fitting ending possible. Same industry, none of the prestige, and no space left to hide inside the word professionalism. What stayed with me wasn't just that she cheated. It was how calmly she built a world where cheating looked like success. That was the part that took me the longest to process. I had been proud of her. I had defended her schedule, justified the distance, and ignored things that would have set off alarms in almost anybody else. I told myself I was being supportive. I told myself trust was what good husbands do. And trust does matter, but trust without attention turns into permission for the wrong person. I missed red flags because I wanted the story she gave me to be true. I wanted to believe the extra calls, the overnight bags, the better clothes, the private business accounts, and the disappearing evenings were all leading somewhere good for us. They weren't. They were leading away from me the entire time. Still, I don't regret how I handled the end of it. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't try to outlie a liar. I got proof, got legal advice, made my move, and let reality do the rest. That matters to me now more than any fantasy of revenge ever could. When someone is that committed to deception, the cleanest answer is not chaos. It's clarity. You stop arguing with what they say, and you start acting on what they do. That was the lesson. Not that people can be cruel. I already knew that. The lesson was that once the evidence is real, hesitation only helps the person already betraying you. My marriage ended, and that hurt more than I can put into one story. But the life I have now is at least real. No fake consultations, no fake late-night business calls, no smiling across the dinner table at someone treating honesty like a tool for weaker people. I'd rather live with an ugly truth than a polished lie. If you've ever been in a situation where something felt off and you kept talking yourself out of it, listen to that feeling a little sooner than I did. Sometimes the thing that looks like ambition, stress, or distance is exactly what it looks like. And sometimes the only way your life gets better is by finally refusing to explain away what's right in front of you. If this story hit home for you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real stories about betrayal, consequences, and what it takes to take your life back. What warning signs would have stood out to you first in this story? Would you have confronted Elise early or handled it the same way I did and stayed quiet until the proof was airtight? And once the truth was this big, do you think there was ever any point in a face-to-face confrontation at all?